Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you. We're going to get started so we can give as much time to this important session. My name is Nick Pinchok, and I'm with the Great Lakes West Comprehensive Center, one of the hosts for today, and we're very pleased that you're all here at the event and at our session today. As I'm sure you all know, assessment has been one of the more emphasized aspects of educational practice in the last 10-plus years. I think all of us deal with testing and assessment issues nearly every day in our jobs. I think we know that testing and assessment in and of themselves don't improve educational outcomes. However, there's empirical evidence behind formative assessment practices that do show to impact student outcomes at all levels, and that more intelligent uses of data and smarter assessments truly can improve educational outcomes. And we have two wonderful panelists today to help us hopefully see a smarter path forward and give you some ideas at the macro and micro level at your schools, in your districts, and in your states for how to be smarter about formative assessments, formative assessment practice, and using other assessments in formative ways. What I'm going to do very quickly is just overview the agenda that we will do our best to adhere to. We're going to have two panelist presentations, one from Stanley Rabinowitz and a second from Alexandra Pardo. We want to leave as much time for questions and answers after. And we'll remind you again, because we're taping our sessions, to either speak into the microphone that's at the back of the room, and hopefully we'll have a microphone that we can pass around too. We're going to have two very different perspectives, and you may have a lot of questions from both perspectives, and we want to give as much time to you as possible to do that. Then we want to try to provide you as much time as well to think about what you've heard and how that will apply to your jobs after the event. And we have the room separated on the far right side from up here with district staff. Through the middle, we have state education agencies and school-based staff on the far left side. You are welcome to get different perspectives at your tables or join in different ways if you'd like. But this configuration works for us. And if you're comfortable, what we'd like you to do is take some time to review some guiding questions, which we'll provide, and then report out at the end as to what you think the strong takeaways are and ways that you might be able to incorporate the content and the lessons from today's presentation. So, again, thank you for coming. First, I'd like to introduce Stanley Rabinowitz. Dr. Rabinowitz is the director of the Assessment and Accountability Comprehensive Center. He's also the director of Assessment Services at the West Ed Comprehensive Center, he is overseeing the role of project manager for the Smarter Balanced Assessment Consortium. That's one of the two federally funded Race to the Top assessment consortia that I'm assuming half of you are associated with in the room, PARC being the other assessment consortia, and he'll be giving us some perspectives both from that national assessment consortia world as well as balanced assessment systems in general. I'd like to welcome Dr. Rabinowitz. I'm going to introduce Alexandra real quickly. And secondly, we have Alexandra Pardo, who is the academic director for the Thurgood Marshall Academy Charter School in Washington, D.C., and she's going to be talking about some of the great work that they're doing at their school. And prior to coming to Thurgood Marshall, she was also a teacher and administrator in the D.C. public school system. So if we could give a hand to Alexandra, please. So I'm going to turn it over to Stanley for his presentation.
None of this hiding behind a podium for me. I'm going to come right. You want to sit back there? I'm going to come to you. How's that? This is really a unique situation. I used to work for a state agency. This is the first time the state agency has been poised to protect the staff from the administrators. So let's see how that has to work that way. Maybe we can separate out and see what happens in the middle. So I've got 30 minutes, and I tried to figure out, so what should I tell you in 30 minutes? And I may be feeling a little nostalgic. I had a birthday last week, and it may be shocking for you to know that with my birthday, I've been doing this for about 30 years. I know I look way too young to have been doing this for 30 years, but I have been. And so you start getting big lessons. You start getting big issues. So what do I want you to know in 30 minutes? Mostly, I guess I use my PowerPoint. But I did a presentation last week where the PowerPoint was just left kind of to prove that I was there. But a lot of what I talked about wasn't from the PowerPoint. It was the lessons learned. It was the consolation across the issues. So I am going to talk about that stuff. What is a balanced system? What's the relationship among formative, interim, and summative? What are implications for each, for instruction, but also for accountability? And what's unique about high schools? This is a high school conference. I will talk about how these issues play out at high school. But mostly what I want you to walk away with is that this is a very different world from 30 years ago, from 2 years ago. When I started doing this, we were able to use a word or a phrase that right now would be shocking. When we first did testing, you know what we tested? Minimum basic skills. And if you take a look at the tests we used 30 years ago, compared to what you're using now, anyone who questions whether or not kids and schools are making progress, I got to tell you, you're failing a lot harder tests than you did if you failed a test today. And in fact, not everybody fails. Passing a test now, the amount of skills that we require on a test, let alone in your curriculum, is so much more rigorous now than it was 30 years ago. We had on a high school graduation test 30 years ago in the state I worked in, and it wasn't unusual, we had double-digit addition. Standalone, not even as part of a word problem. How many of you looked at the Common Core state standards? I think you enter school having to know double-digit addition. They don't even teach that anymore. Because starting first grade, you have to be doing like pre-calculus. And in kindergarten, you have to be already literate. You have to be reading and writing stories, not pretend stories. You have to be writing them and typing them without spell check. That's just a little bit of an exaggeration. The world of assessment has changed because the world of curriculum has changed, because the expectation of college and career readiness have changed. And what I'm hoping to do when we talk about a balanced system, would you go to the next slide, please? What are we balancing when we talk about a system? What needs to be controlled? What needs to be... There's the most overused word today. It's a real popular word. I'm sure you all have popular words that are overused, and mostly they're used wrong. My favorite popular overused word is the term coherent, which actually has a very specific mathematical use. Now, everybody uses it. Coherent means now that A doesn't bump into B and C is kind of in the right direction. The formal definition of coherence is system, is that all the pieces fit together and properly define the domain. Well, what I'd like to talk about in a balanced assessment system is all the parts working together. Right now, a lot of you are buying assessment systems locally. They're basically clones of your state assessment system, and you're calling it formative assessment. Well, if you wanted kids to practice on your state test, that'd be one thing to do. But I wouldn't do it all year long, Because every now and then you actually have to teach kids so that you don't have to just practice. They're actually doing it. Making sure that our system does different pieces as opposed to just duplicating each piece is a large part of a balanced assessment system. Why? Because what are we balancing? We're balancing cost. If your local testing program is simply a clone of the state test, then why are you buying it when you can just use released state items or last year's state test? What you want to do is have a local system that does different things, that serves instructional, not accountability purposes. Because the state test, no matter what it pretends to do, is primarily an accountability test. It's been built to do that, and it does it very well in whatever state you live in. As will the consortia test. The summative pieces are accountability. And when I build an interim or a formative system, I develop it differently than when I build a summative test. So if you're just buying a clone, you're wasting. So that's a cost constraint. That's a cost balance. Next thing is constraints. Accountability testing requires a degree of technical rigor that's different than any other test that's designed. Why? Because there are consequences to failure other than you feel bad. If it's a high school graduation test and you don't pass, you don't graduate. And if it's school accountability, if your kids don't pass, there are consequences. And now more and more as we move into teacher evaluation based on testing primarily, there are even more consequences. So if I'm building an accountability test, I can't do some things that I'd actually want to do if I'm building a local formative test. I can take more risks locally. I don't have to have the same degree of technical reliability, but there are other kinds of technical criteria that a local test needs to have. It needs to have more instructional validity. It needs to have more instructional sensitivity. It needs to have, most importantly, consequential validity. Meaning if I use this test, good things happen. I teach the right way. Whereas if you just buy an off-the-shelf clone of your state test, you may not get quite that kind of test. So balancing constraints, there are different constraints at different parts of the system, and you need to be aware of that. Balancing risk. Again, the state test has to have more constraints on it. It's a less risky test. Why? Because it has much greater external scrutiny, including potentially courts, including potentially every constituency in the state. A locally developed testing system can take greater risks, can substitute less technical expertise with more instructional expertise, because it needs to satisfy a different kind of audience, a different kind of expectation. And finally, we need to balance roles. Teachers do certain things. State folks do certain things. District folks do certain things. And different tests better match what those roles are. So if I were building a balanced state assessment system that had various pieces, my state people ought to be concerned about accountability summative testing and put their energy there. District folks may be much more interested in interim assessment, tracking progress across and within classrooms and schools. At the school itself, the best role that you can play is formative assessment, classroom, day-to-day interaction with students, so that you know what we call actionable information, immediately actionable information. You have information right in the teacher's hand every day so that you know what to do tomorrow with that class and with those students. You can't do that with a state test. You shouldn't do that with an interim assessment. But if you have a properly built formative assessment system, then you can do that. Let's go to the next slide, please. So what makes a good system? It starts with coherence. That my parts mesh. No one test can do anything. I mean, oops. That was a bad thing I said. We'll erase the test. No one test can do everything. So what we need to do to measure all the parts of our system is make sure our pieces are coherent. We have those separate components. Indicators need to justify their inclusion. That means if I'm going to buy an interim system or use formative assessments, then I need to be sure that I have information that they provide better data, better actionable information than what I currently have. A lot of interim assessment systems basically repeat the information that the state test provides. You know what the worst phrase I've ever heard as a marketing phrase? Buy my system. It predicts performance on the state test. You know why that's bad? Because the purpose of local assessment is to not predict what the state test can do, is to break the prediction cycle. If your formative assessment predicts state results, then you haven't done anything locally. You haven't intervened. The best marketing system is that my interim system, my formative system, breaks the cycle of prediction. Right now, you know what the best prediction of fourth grade math is? Third grade math. And unfortunately, the best predictor of 12th grade math is fourth grade math. That's a cynical system. That's a system where nothing is happening. The best system is when the cycle of predictability is broken. And that's how you justify an instrument. A coherent system, a balanced system, uses its components wisely. It has formative, interim, and summative. It uses on-demand and classroom embedded, meaning it has tests and it has ongoing performance. It uses multiple choice when it's appropriate, but doesn't stop there. Has constructed response. And it has performance tasks over time to really measure the expectation of the Common Core with generalizability and transfer across content. And it respects and uses differentiated roles across the system. See how coherent this presentation is? I go from the last bullet to the next slide. I mean, I do this for a living. I'm good at this. All right, so I'm going to say something blasphemous now. Every one of my slides, I start with something to make sure you're still awake. I'm going to say something blasphemous. You know what the best part of NCLB was? I know, you're waiting, right? It's good. I like participation. That was only reading and math and a little bit of science. People ask, where's social studies? How come science is only 3 grades? Where's the arts and all that other good stuff? Well, as far as I'm concerned, the proper role of the federal government is limited. And at least that part they got right. Now, what is the proper role for states and for the different pieces of the local roles? The federal target and minimum Proficiency, what is enough for all? And then good luck. Some resources, some assistance, but figure it out locally. For the state, accountability systems, school targets, state targets. Accountability based on state conditions, state history, state initiatives, resources, and a dirty word these days, but one I'm not afraid to use, values. Different states value different kinds of outcomes. And they ought to have that in their systems. And that ought to continue down locally. The local role should be on curriculum and instruction using the state targets to make sure that all kids do learn, but being sure that there's enough flexibility at the curriculum, at the instructional, and therefore at the formative and interim assessment level for local initiative, local values, and local control. So that, to me, is how the differentiated roles work. If you're local, you shouldn't try to duplicate the state role, the state test. If you're a state, you should be providing resources and opportunities for local, but options for them to really use the strength and the energy that comes out when it's a local initiative. Next, please. Okay. So now let's get to why is high school so much trouble. And high school really is a lot of trouble when you're doing testing. I kind of like that because trouble is fun for me. But it's not always fun for you, but I'll just tell you why you're so special and what kinds of problems you make for people like me. The first thing is, how do you define college and career readiness? And then what do you do about it? So let me give you some challenges with the Common Core standards. The Common Core standards at the high school level have a very explicit definition of college ready, but there's a problem with their definition of college ready in that if you talk to most freshman faculty at college, especially those not teaching math courses, they will tell you that the math in the Common Core does not match what they think students need in math in freshman courses. Maybe if you're going to be an engineering major, but even that, there's some differences. So the first challenge there is that the definition of college ready in the Common Core standards isn't coherent with what college faculty think you need. Second problem is it basically gives lip service to career ready by saying, well, college and career ready at 18-year-old is the same thing. And then they move on to their next sentence. Well, there is no real evidence that college and career ready at 18-year-olds is the same thing. But it doesn't do enough research there. And third, okay, so suppose we accept that definition of college and career ready. How do I then build down from high school to middle school and elementary school to measure student growth and achievement towards that? So one thing the assessment consortia are struggling with is, should we have the same reporting strands at high school as we have at elementary school? Should we have the same balance of information, the same balance of content across each of the levels? And we haven't decided that one yet. But for your system to truly align, for your middle schools to come to you ready, then we need to make sure both from the curriculum side and the assessment side, we get that coherence right. So that's the first challenge. Yep, thank you. Second challenge is grade placement. When I started doing high school graduation testing 30 years ago, we had a 9th grade test. We had an easy 9th grade test. kids still failed. But my favorite phone call when I was a state testing director was from a parent of a 9th grade student who called and said, "My daughter has just passed her high school graduation test. Why can't you go to college next year?" Well, I mentioned the fact that there are these like course requirements and it's still just a 9th grade test. Why did we put it in 9th grade? We put it in 9th grade because we were scared to death that kids would need 4 years of remediation to pass the darn thing. That's why we put it there. Now most state graduation tests are either spring in 10 or grade 11. Not necessarily because we got better at remediation, but because we couldn't call something a high school test and put it in 9th grade. Okay, so let's just call it what it is. Put it in 12th grade. Well, we know if we put it in 12th grade and kids fail, then what are they going to do? So figuring out where to put your high school test is a big factor for states. But it's less of a concern for districts if you have an interim and formative system that builds up to the state accountability test. And so you need an 8th grade system that connects to your 9th grade assessment system. And you need coherence between the performance with the state standards, with the Common Core standards, and with local values and initiatives that make that connection through your local assessment system, formative or interim. Okay. Oh, integrated assessments. The ELA Common Core standards is something very interesting. How many of you are science and social studies teachers here? Guess what? You're teaching literacy. I mean, you were doing that anyway, I hope. So, I mean, if you're here, you're probably doing it anyway. But now you're doing it as part of the formal state content standards in ELA. It's really a very significant change. And you know what we start? Oh, I still have the scars from the math wars. And I still have scars from the calculator wars. You know what the next generation of scars are going to be called? The Shakespeare scars. And that is, in our ELA classes, and you know what? This gets to be an either and, not an either or. Do they still get to teach Shakespeare when college and career ready is increasingly more about informational text and text to perform a task, which is virtually not done in most traditional English classes, and is now increasingly going to be done in science, social studies, and other content areas. So fighting those wars about the science and social studies teacher teaching literacy and the English teacher is teaching more than just literature is going to be an interesting set of battles which needs to be reflected in your local assessment system and your state assessment system. If you want science and social studies to teach literacy, then you better be assessing literacy. You better have tests in those areas that require reading and writing. And you better have English tests that aren't just literature-based. And that doesn't even begin to get at speaking and listening, which is also part of Common Core. Who owns speaking and listening? You need to figure that out. Yep. Okay. The coolest thing happening over the next generation. I'm going to ask a question. Is anyone here in this room debating whether assessment should be online anymore? The question isn't if. The question is when and how to do that. And the biggest mistake I see states making as they go from paper to pencil to online assessment is they basically use the most expensive piece of paper ever invented by humankind. They take the paper and pencil item and basically you just paste it to the computer screen because it's the same darn item. The only advantage you get is shipping and perhaps quicker scoring. But you're doing nothing about using the technology to take advantage of changing assessments. You know what breaks my heart? A lot of things in this world, but I'm going to just limit it to the topic today. States that do an online writing and basically disable every part of the writing program, like spell check, like all kinds of things. So you're basically setting up kids to fail because they learn how to write in instruction and at home with the full capacity of Word or any other program that they're using. And then they go to a test, and it's so artificial, you might as well just give them that piece of paper again. You don't let them cut and paste because they may be bringing something with them. You don't let them revise properly. You don't let them spell check because, God forbid, you haven't found out by 12th grade that they can't spell. Or that in the real world, they wouldn't have spell check. And if they can get it done that way, when was the last time any of you wrote more than 2 sentences with a pencil? My hand hurts after the first sentence. Yeah, but you took time. Those aren't real sentences. And if this was done properly, I'd have given you this online, and you could be typing this. Now you have to type it back in later. Yeah. Every room has a wise guy. Thank you. I appreciate it. Because that's usually me. Yes, thank you. The power of assessment for science and social studies, the experiments, the labs, for writing, for reading, for the speaking and the listening. What we need to do is make sure we don't get lazy or cheap and just basically transfer our paper tests to the computer. But there's another side too. The silliest thing I've ever seen are amateur efforts to build computer items. We're talking to kids who, as Alexa said, carry such power in their pocketbooks. The graphics on my iPhone, for God's sake, if you have the equivalent of, stick figures on your local assessments because that's what you can afford or know how to do, kids are going to laugh at you. It has to be sophisticated. I mean, they've got arcades in their pocket. So you can't just do this on the cheap if you want kids to use it and take it seriously. We need to invest. Growth becomes a problem at high school. Growth models that look at 4th grade math versus 5th grade math and compute the difference, it makes sense because 5th grade math looks a lot like 4th grade math, only it's a little harder. And in English 11 versus English 12, or English 10 versus English 11, all right, the continent may change, but the skills are the same. It may go from American literature to world literature, but the skills are the same. Well, I know a lot of kids who are really, really, really good at algebra and really, really, really lousy at geometry. As I don't know that many kids who are really, really, really good at reading English versus really, really, really bad at reading American English or translated French English. Building our growth models in a trajectory of algebra, geometry, and trig. What does growth mean from algebra to geometry when it could be just kids are better at geometry than they are at algebra? Or in science, they are better. Oh, I was really, really good at chemistry. Biology, I had to work a lot harder. I wasn't quite as good at that. A growth model, when I was in high school, we went biology, chemistry. My chemistry teacher would have looked really, really good based on me simply because biology preceded chemistry, and He took advantage of the fact that I was better at chemistry than biology. My biology teacher, had he been second, wouldn't have looked as good. So we do have content trajectory differences at high school that don't quite play out at elementary and middle school. Yeah. Two last things. Boy, there's a lot of testing in high school. So I got a trick for you. I'm going to end with a trick. This could be the one thing that you leave with today that you're going to use when you come back, when you go back to your district. And that is, don't call your formative assessment system formative assessment. Call it formative instruction. Because that really is what you're doing. You are tracking student progress day by day, class by class, month by month, using instructional techniques that take advantage of ongoing feedback and supports. Doesn't it sound like good teaching? Ultimately, that's what formative assessment is. Ongoing supports, appropriately timed, leading to immediate, actionable instruction. Thank you. Thanks. Here you go.
Thank you, Stanley. And we're going to turn it over to Alexandra.
I don't know that I have pockets, actually. I don't have pockets. Okay, I don't have pockets to put the hand mic in. But welcome, everyone. I'm Alexandra Pardo. I'm the academic director at Thurgood Marshall Academy. And I'm actually going to pick up on where Stanley left off and talk about what we've done at Thurgood Marshall Academy in terms of assessments and how we've improved instruction. And so the first thing I'm going to talk about is context, because every time I hear these presentations, to me, context really matters. Because I always sit in the audience and say, that's not my kids, that's not my school. And so I think we need to start off with thinking about who is Thurgood Marshall Academy, why do we have something to share about data, and what do we do with the data? So the first is to who we are. We were founded in 2001 by the ideas believed by Justice Thurgood Marshall. We came out of Georgetown University Street Law Clinic, and we have a twofold mission: to prepare students to succeed in college and actively engage in our democratic society. With that, it's important to know who our students are. We serve 390 students, 79% Title I, 10% special ed, 100% African American, and 95%, for those who are familiar with DC, come east of the river in wards 7 and 8. And in a minute, I'm going to show why that has a lot of significance for us. In a lot of areas, charter school students will come from across the city or across an area. In DC, and specifically in our case, our students are very localized because we have a natural geographic, which is a river that passes through the city, and kids do not cross that river. Those of you who are familiar with DC, those of you who are not, and it's a little hard to see, you can see the statistics for wards 7 and 8. Most compelling for us, because of our college prep mission, is that 8% of adults in Ward 8 have a college degree, and we are located in Ward 8. 50% of our adults are functionally illiterate. There was a study on DC high schools recently. 1 in 9 of our freshmen ever make it to college. And so the statistics are incredibly sobering when you look at the students who we are working with and the parents who we are working with. This is clicking away. We also have the highest percentage of births to teen moms, the highest amount of crime, highest HIV percentage in the district. The District of Columbia has the highest HIV proportion in the entire country. So there are 100 reasons why we as a school and as a standalone high school should fail. So we start off with TMA 4 years ago, and I started at TMA in 05-06. And so 4 years ago, we had less than 20% of our students passing our state tests, and less than 40% passing our state test in math. Our discipline was ridiculous, and those of you who are high school folks know what it means to have kids who walk in the hallways. We had 30% of our teachers at that point were highly qualified. About 80% were first-year teachers, brand new to the building. And so it was not a pretty picture. And we knew we had to do something about it because we knew we had a choice. We were either going to be shut down by our authorizer or we were going to change and reform. And so we knew we didn't want to be shut down. And so when you look at what we've done, we were in the 18-20%. We're now at 62 and 72% in math and reading. We've made a lot of growth, and what I'm going to talk about is how we've made that growth. Because this was not a one-size-fits-all model. It was not a product off the shelf. It was a lot of hard work by teachers and students. As our DC CAS state test scores grew, which is our state assessment, we saw a threefold increase in our AP test scores. We went from 0% students passing the AP exam to 42% passing the AP exam. Our SAT scores have increased 150 points. We've had a 100% college acceptance rate. 96% of our last 4 graduating classes have enrolled in college immediately upon graduation, and 72% of all of our graduates are still enrolled in college. And we spend a lot of time and resources now actually on our alumni tracking because we've really shifted our focus not from how do you get a high school diploma from Thurgood Marshall, but how do you get a college diploma 4 years after you leave Thurgood Marshall. So we've done a lot of work in that last part. We've been recognized both nationally and locally, and so one of the things we've done is we've worked with AED based on a dissemination grant we got from our state. Our state, the District of Columbia, has recognized some of our work. We've started partnering with high schools in the DC area to bottle some of our best practices and teach them through sessions and professional developments on how to replicate a lot of what we've done. We're the only charter and one of 6 schools that the Department of Ed has recognized on its Doing What Works features. 2 years ago, Harvard recognized us as their Achievement Gap Institute, which you heard Susan speak about this morning as well. And we were actually also on CBS for our alumni program last year, if you saw the evening news. And so people are listening because we definitely have done a lot of great work. And we've seen it as a 4-part model. And so the first part is the leadership, and that is the entire administrative team being absolutely committed to what we're doing. The second piece, which is what I'll spend most of the time talking about, is the teacher piece, because this can't be done with teachers. It cannot be done just by a principal. The teachers are the most integral part of this entire system. We have staffing structures that support student behavior and emotional development needs. One of the things that we were very honest with ourselves as a school in my first year is it didn't matter how great the teachers were, and it didn't matter what they were teaching if the kids were not in the classrooms to listen. If all of my students were in the hallways or if all of my kids were not in school, it didn't matter if the best math teacher was standing up in front of the classroom. And so we had to put a lot of work into our behavioral and emotional development of our students. And then also look at number 4, which were what do we do with our kids once the bell rings at 3:30? What opportunities do we provide? Because we know we're in a neighborhood that if we let them leave at 3:30, there's not a lot of positive things happening. So we focused on creating a database cycle of instructional improvement. And so with this, we were a school improvement plan, school. We were on year 2 of corrective action. So we were really close to restructuring. And as our test scores grew, we're now no longer in school improvement. We created a system that both had summative and formative assessments. And one thing off of Stanley's presentation that was really important to us was when we created our formative assessments, we at the school, and this is where I think our state and us had a bit of a dialogue and is continually having a dialogue on, should formative assessments count for teacher evaluations? What is the purpose of formative assessments? Are they for instruction for teachers, or do they count on teacher evaluations? Because depending on how you answer that question is going to really depend on how teachers use these assessments. Are they afraid of these assessments? Are they doing whatever they can to get kids to pass, sometimes perhaps not ethically? Or are they truly using them to say, what standards are my kids mastering, why and how, and what am I doing about my instruction? And I think that often gets overlooked, and teachers and schools send the wrong messages to each other and to students, and that, to us, was really important. We did use Scantron's performance theory as a summative diagnostic to look at grade levels for students. One thing is there are a ton of off-the-shelf products you can use for assessments. We happen to use Scantron. By no means am I advocating to use it. It is a tool we use, but it is not the solution. There is a lot of work, and I'll show the work we have to do outside of what Scantron can provide, because the reporting structures of a lot of off-the-shelf products are very they're weak. They provide one layer of data, and you cannot really get a comprehensive picture of how to improve instruction from a lot of the off-the-shelf products. Our benchmarks, and where we use Scantron is we use it to score our tests. It makes scoring a lot easier. We use it to do an answer key, but our teachers are the ones who are making our benchmark assessments. Our teachers had a very long dialogue. Does it make sense to use an off-the-shelf interim assessment, or does it make sense to do it in-house? We went back and forth and really thought that doing it in-house made a lot more sense because our teachers know what pace, they know their curriculum better than any off-the-shelf product will. They can go back and identify that, you know what, on quarter 2 interim assessment, we really need to hone in 10th grade on this geometry standard because they were weak the test before, or they've not yet mastered that. An off-the-shelf product can't do that at the same level, and that's really important for our teachers. They tweak these benchmarks every year. They do not give the same benchmarks year to year because the kids' needs, their strengths, their weaknesses are different. What they come in with this school year was different where they struggled with last school year. And so they are all developed by faculty as a team, and that's how we got a lot of buy-in. My first year, I had 4 algebra teachers who were teaching 4 different Algebra 1 curriculums. It was once we implemented a faculty-led benchmark assessment system that made them realize there's no point in teaching different things. They might as well collaborate because they're all going to be assessing the same things. That's how we changed curriculum and instructions. We use these assessments as the guiding tool to do that. And that's where we also got buy-in. The key thing with this was we changed our whole school dynamics. So when we did our school calendar, the first thing that goes on our school calendar is when are we giving these assessments. Once we identify those dates, a week later, we pick a half day to take off so our teachers can go through the data. We found that it makes no sense 4 or 5 weeks after kids test to look at data. We're past that at that point. We have, within a week, a time devoted for teachers. We close school down for half a day to solely analyze data. And that's really important for us in terms of how we make our calendar, and it also speaks to the value we place on this. In these data review meetings, teachers will meet in grade levels and in content levels. So we have the math team meets with the science folks, our English and social studies folks meet together, and our special education team decides based on how their students did whether they want to sit with the math and science folks or with the English and social studies folks. And we talk about what makes more sense each time. We look very intensely at what the tests did, what we asked, and how students did. And what I shared at the tables, and this is all on the website online, is some of our reporting. Because one of the things we learned along the way is that all the reporting features of all the off-the-shelf products were not good enough and did not actually change instruction. They were what Stanley said. They were the same reports that the state test gave us, but they didn't actually, we couldn't use them to improve instruction. So the way we start off is we have these half-day PDs. These are semi-facilitated. Myself and my administrative team look at the tests beforehand. We analyze the data beforehand. One of the things we do is we take each test and we circle the right answer. We write what percentage of kids got each question right next to the test items. That's the copy we work off as a team. As a team, we use a variety of reports that we'll talk about in a minute to really analyze what is going on. It is not about what teacher did well, what teacher did poorly. That is something our teachers know and understand, and when we bring in new teachers, the first time they're always hesitant to be like, well, my third period really bombed that question because they think it's scary, they think it's about an evaluation. We don't ever make this evaluative. It is all about instruction. It's all about how did you teach that standard or that objective? How did your colleague teach it? What are the results? How are they different? What are we going to do? How did you do it? We spend most of our time looking at the actual items. We spend maybe 30 seconds looking at class averages because it's not about class averages. It's all about the items and the standards and the student's ability to understand those items and those standards. So that's where the bulk of our time is spent. We look at common errors across students, among student groups, around how things were taught. But it is really about the item and the student results and not about comparing teachers to other teachers, comparing grade levels. Our teachers complete a classroom instructional plan. This is something tangible that they have to do with the report. So they're going to look, they're going to complete for each class period how many kids are on track, how many are below. What were the top 3 standards that were really challenging to each class period? What were the top 3 weakest ones? Where do they need to focus? And then they identify together ways they're going to reteach this in our next cycle. So is it going to be through warm-ups? Is it going to be through do-nows? They identify which questions they want to retest on the next benchmark because they're the ones writing that benchmark. So they're using that information to say, you know what, this question right here or this standard, every time they really messed up on, we've got to retest this. Let's look at different ways of retesting this question. Was it the way we worded this question? How did we test this question on our unit tests, on our quizzes? Was it different? It's all of that dialogue that teachers need to have but don't always have. And we use this system as a means to have that dialogue. Now, in terms of the reporting, and this is where you have this on some of your tables. And so there is the first thing, and this is all done in Excel, because as I said, Scantron is great and products are great, but what we found is that the reporting level features are so weak, and that the only way to get comprehensive analysis is for us to go back and do it by hand in Excel. One of the things we look at a grade level is we look at how students are doing based on what we've taught, what we know we need to teach, and our state assessment. And so one way we run a report is we look at the standards that we know are being taught. We look at the number of items that our state tests, and then we look at how many points students are getting for that test. We then will, and B1, B2 here are our benchmarks, we'll then look at how our students are doing on those each benchmark. We color code it so that it's easily visually appealing to us for green, red, yellow, so we know what's going on. The problem with Scantron and some other assessments, they'll let you do this at one assessment, but you can't compare. If you want to compare, you've got to now print out 4 reports. It's very hard to compare things with 5 pieces of paper across the table. So we've had to use Excel to do all of this for us and found that teachers prefer this method over anything else. We've also done it at the class level, and this is something our teachers have found very helpful. And so what you see here is for number is every number question, and this is just a sample, the percentage of students in that class who got that question correct, what the correct answer was, and then how the students picked which answer across. We use this when we really get into that item level. This is part of a larger spreadsheet, and so what's missing here is actually there's a column to the left that has the students. We do this by teacher and by grade level, and so one of the things our teachers have always said is we need to compare things across, and so what we have is their free and reduced lunch status, male, female, IEP, IEP level, we use levels in DC, their status, their English teacher section, and their social studies section, because if you remember, we lump our English and social studies teachers together. We then run these reports for every teacher for their classes. They want to be able to see how kids did across different benchmarks. They also, for us, when we first started doing this work, a big area of weakness was open responses, which is that OR column. They want to see how students are doing across open responses over time and look at some of that. These are the things that we know our teachers really need to do and enjoy doing, but it takes time. The one that you have mostly on your table is the one that we've spent the most time with our teachers working on. It's the last page of this handout. What our teachers have said is that all this is good, but then they want to get at the student level. And so the way we devise this, and there's a front and a back to it, we create this for our teachers. And that's a key point, is we create all of this for our teachers. Our teachers don't input the data themselves, because we don't want their time being spent on data input. We want their time being spent on data analysis. So in this report, the teacher gets for every class period is every single student, their gender, Title I, special ed. We don't use ELL only because we honestly don't have a single ELL student, so that's why you don't see that. What you then see is a comprehensive result. So you see that question, and this is again a copy, but you'll see language development is our vocabulary standards. You'll see LDV8 is our standard. Then you see that that was the question number 39, 40, 41, 42. You see the correct answers. You see what answers kids picked. And so this lets teachers quickly see how kids did on individual standards on the test. On the bottom, and this is what teachers really find important, they want to know comprehensively, you see number correct 14. How many kids got that question correct? What percentage? So teachers can quickly identify how many students got what question right in each class. Then you have that thick line, and then it shows you by category. So for us in DC, we have 3 areas in English: language development, informational text, literary text. This then shows us that there were 8 questions in language development. Below each student, looking across, you see how many kids got how many questions right out of those 8. For informational text on that test, there were 23 questions. How many questions did students get right out of those 23 in that specific area? And the same thing for literary text. Then you will see the percentage that correlates to those numbers. Our teachers, both in math and English, have said this is really important to them because it's hard for them to grasp this when they just see an individual student got an 86% on a test. That doesn't have meaning. They don't know where that student is struggling, and it's hard for them to figure it out without sitting and counting. They appreciate that we can do all of this work for them because then they can start identifying where are the weaknesses for particular students, particular classes, and really think about how do I improve instruction. This, for us, again, is about improving instruction. It's not about teacher evaluations. We don't at all ever talk about teacher evaluations in this format. But it's important for us to look at this. Again, the reality is that this is a multi-layer piece. This is not done by most products, and you do have to do it by hand, so that takes time. And so to do all that, you know, every school can do this, but there is an element of time and resources in all of this, and there is no question about that. We hire a full-time quality assurance manager, and that's how we use actually most of our Title I funds, who puts all of this data together for our teachers. Because we know that teachers should not spend time inputting data into reports. Our quality assurance manager also then pulls kids who are absent during our testing, because it's very hard for teachers to try to figure out who was absent, how many kids do I have to test, when am I going to do this. So we take a lot of the teacher work out of all of this. And then there's a fidelity question, to be honest. We know our teachers are great, but by having somebody else do all the data analysis, all of your data is going to be accurate. In terms of how we put this all together, our teachers receive continuous support on this. The first thing we do every school year when we come back in August is a 5-hour data walk session where we walk through this again. We go back to last year, we look at what worked, what didn't, what do we need to tweak, where are we, how are our students, where are we going. Teachers have time built into their schedules, so we do the half-day PDs continuously within a week. It's like clockwork. We give these tests on a Wednesday, Thursday. The following Thursday is a half-day PD to review this. It's absolutely critical that we have to have time built into our schedule to do this. We've now created formats and templates that are user-friendly for our teachers. They know what to expect. They're getting the same format, the same templates every single time. And we use the data effectively because it's a quick turnaround. Teachers then can also access this. We email it out to teachers. We give them hard copies because teachers function differently. Some teachers like to take these templates, sit with a pen and pencil, and do it all by hand. Others like to do Excel sorting. So we make it accessible to them in every format as long as they're working. Team. I can't stress enough how much this has changed our school culture. We used to have a school building where the English and social studies teachers were 2 departments. They didn't need to talk to each other. The 10th grade teacher is now our biggest champion on writing open response questions for students. She collaborates more with the English department than you can imagine because she is absolutely invested because she sits in on these team meetings. She gets the same reports as the English teacher on looking at how can students improve writing. It's critical for our special ed team to be a part of this process. We can't ignore our special ed students, and none of us can. And so our special ed team gets the same reports as our English teachers, as our math teachers, for their student population. It's not an add-on. It's not sit next to and share that data. But we really do this collaboratively as a team. The teachers know I and the rest of the administration look at all the assessments. We know kids' scores inside and out, and the kids know we know their scores inside and out. Every single quarter, I go in with the kids and I do a graphing activity where the kids graph their benchmark scores and we talk about did they improve, did they not improve. It's a school-wide effort, and that's a real big part of that team process. The resources, as I mentioned, we do have a full-time quality assurance manager who does all of the data work in terms of collecting the data, testing students, ensuring the fidelity of the data. We did purchase Scantron, which is a resource allocation, but as I said, for us, it's a tool. It's not Scantron creating our assessments. It's Scantron to grade our assessments. We have a school SIS that allows us to load all that data and to work within the data and massage a lot of that data. And then we have to have a communication loop between our staff and our IT so that we get what we need at the school level. And then in terms of accountability, we know that we have to hold teachers accountable. And as we heard this morning, what gets monitored is what gets done. And so our teachers create these classroom instructional plans every time we review the data. When our administrative team, when our department chairs are doing walkthroughs and classroom observations, we're looking and saying, you said you were going to do these 4 or 3 standards or objectives. I need to see that when I'm walking through those classrooms. If you said you're going to test this on your unit exam or add this to your portfolio assessment, we should be seeing that. If we're never seeing it, there's a problem. The teachers feel a sense of accountability in the building at this point, and what happens, which is really great, when we have the English team together during these meetings, the 9th and 10th grade teams are together. So the 10th grade team will turn around to that 9th grade team and say, hey, Kalia, when she was in your class last year, she's really struggling with vocabulary. Was that true last year when she was in 9th grade? That didn't happen before because we didn't create that same format for teachers to have that level of sharing and collaboration. So that's my contact for those who would want it. Yep.
Well, thank you, Alexandra and Stanley, for those good insights. And as you heard and know, formative assessment at the high school level means different things to different people, can take on different perspectives and philosophies and strategies. So what questions do you have for our panelists? And if you're able to, we have a microphone in the back to record your questions, and Asta is going to pass around the wireless mic too. What questions do you have? Asta?
Good afternoon. Question about your tracking of your students when they go to the post-secondary level. How do you track to know how they're doing at the next level?
Sure. So we do have an alumni coordinator that we hire whose job is to track our students. We use the National Student Clearinghouse, which is a database that you can purchase that will track student enrollment in college based on Social Security numbers, and you can see whether they've enrolled in a particular school or not. Not every college is part of that, so there are a few colleges that are not. Part of the work our alumni coordinator does is Facebook, text messages, emails, any way we can get to students to find out where they're enrolled. We do have an alumni scholarship fund because we found a lot of our kids were dropping out of college because they couldn't afford a calculator, a textbook, a housing deposit. So our students are eligible for the grant money from us, and so when they do receive that money, we in exchange say we need to see a copy of your transcript, and we make those purchases. So it's constant data gathering in a multiple varied ways of formats. I'm sorry? Yeah, we have. So we've established an alumni grant, and so it's money that we have set aside in our budget every year, and all of our alumni are eligible for up to $500 each semester to apply for grant money that keeps them in school. Because of our student population, we've literally, for example, last year we had an alumni who got into a full ride for University of Michigan, and she got to the airport and could not afford the baggage fee from D.C. to Michigan to pay for her luggage and was in a panic. And so we've established that alumni grant fund for exactly those reasons that would keep kids from going to college that in the suburbs would be unheard of, but for our kids are a real reality.
Will you say again the name of that software you purchased?
It's the National Student Clearinghouse tracker. I think it's like it's like $500 a year. It's pretty inexpensive. It just takes some manual labor because you have to input all your kids' Social Security numbers.
Can I follow?
Yeah.
It's an interesting point about what really matters for defining college and career ready. If you look at work of people like David Conley, he recognizes that the content matters, but the dispositions and knowing the world matters at least as much. My guess is you'll lose more kids, not from content, but either from the environment or not understanding what it really means to be successful. And just that notion about, you mean when you fly, you have to pay for something beyond your ticket? I mean, I don't know any school that teaches that. And maybe you've added that to your instructional package now.
We do have a senior seminar course, actually, that goes over all this.
Yeah, you can't just stop with the content. You really have to figure out what the life skills are and the generalization of the life skills, and then figuring out how to assess that. I mean, you can't do a field trip, send every kid to the airport, and see who gets to his or her destination. Right. But you do need to have some kind of simulation or life lessons as part of your curriculum and assessment system. That's a great example. Can I steal that example?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
She's a sophomore at Michigan now. So.
Right. She's never actually gotten home now since she can't afford to come home. But that's probably, given the environment, not always a bad thing.
It's a good thing.
Other questions?
Hi, my name is Matt from Oregon. I just have a question kind of for both of you. How do you balance, maybe you can both comment on, how do you balance the need to do more open response type questions and not just have all multiple choice with the need to collect data? I noticed one of your sheets says open response data. What is that? How does that work? It's kind of a logistical question, and maybe you can talk about how you balance that.
So one of the things we first learned when we started doing this work is 50% of our kids were not even answering the open response questions. And so talk about, like, where do you start? Let's start there. Forget the multiple choice, actually. They were filling in the bubbles, but they saw a question they had to write. No, half of them weren't even doing those questions. And so we were getting horrible test results because the kids were not prepared in class to answer those questions. And what we said with our teachers is these open response questions that you have to do on the state test, they also exist on the SAT and on the AP exam. So this is not about a state test. Every test kids are going to take is going to require them to produce knowledge more than a bubble. And so on our benchmark or our interim assessments, they all have an open response question. On our unit tests, our math teams, our English teams, on every unit test have to have open response questions. Our social studies tests have to have open response, so they're part of the way we now teach. The students know that this is part of what you do. You have to have a written component because it's not enough to give them algebra or geometry test and just fill in bubbles. But we had to work with our teachers, as Stanley said before, in terms of teaching them how to do this and work through that process of what are all of our expectations. One of the things we do in our half-day sessions, I take a sample of all the open response questions that kids did, and all the teachers look at them and we score them blindly and then say, well, what did the teacher who was grading this actually give it? Did they give it a 3, 2, 1? We use the rubrics on the state test so that the kids and the teachers are familiar with the expectations. And then we also look at the SAT because to us that's really important. This is not just about a 10th grade test. This is about an SAT and an AP test that's coming out.
That's a great question, and I actually have some very concrete ways for you to address that issue, because it always becomes teacher burden. They don't mind administering them. They just don't want to score them or use them. So it seems like a lot of work for nothing. And it's very timely. I was meeting with a national assessment program last week who hired us to help them develop their formative assessment supports. And their summative assessment, which is really high stakes, includes open response, but they were willing, because of teacher burden, to allow teachers to opt out of the open response of the formative system. And I just sort of reminded them that, well, won't that kind of interfere with how teachers teach if you do that? And how do you expect them? And they got it, but they couldn't get around the teacher burden part. So here's one very small idea and one very big idea for how do you get around that. I'm going to start with the small idea. And it's tied into Alexandra's very wise recommendation to, as much as possible, keep your formative system out of teacher evaluation. So here's a crazy small idea. Who says the teacher has to score the open response? Why can't the kids score their own constructed response or score each other's constructed response? Make that part of the learning activity. Teach them how to do that. You know, the best way to learn something is to teach it. The best way to test your understanding is to measure it and evaluate it through yourself and your other self-reflection, peer reflection and evaluation. You can't do that if there's part of a teacher evaluation. But you can do it if it's part of formative instruction. So that's the small idea. What's the big idea? Within 5 years, and increasingly now, open response items, especially the smaller ones, can be scored through artificial intelligence. And many of our interim packages are coming now or very soon with the option for an artificial intelligently scored computer and scored open response. Now again, if this is for evaluation, you may not trust it. But for just classroom instructional purposes, the AI option, the computer scored option with teacher read-behinds can be a very good option. So there really are small and big ideas to keep that from being a burden. But the last thing you want to do is remove that burden from teachers of using the results, because those are the money items. That's where you're getting at the higher level skills.
Alexandra, if you could talk a little bit about the CIP and what that looks like, and a little bit more how you use it.
Sure, and I meant to put it in a slide and forgot when I realized that last night. So the front page of it is basically teacher name. Then it's a table where they fill in their classes, so English 10 period 1, English 10 period 2. Then they put in the number of kids that were proficient, which is the passing term in DC. So they fill out number of kids proficient, number of kids not proficient by each class period. Then they figure out the percentages. Then on the back side, they identify for each class period that they teach, and we're on a block, so and we do double blocks of reading and math, so none of our teachers teach more than 3 periods of English and math in 9th and 10th grade. They identify for each class what were the 3 weakest standards. Then what were the 3 strongest standards. They identify, are there overlaps between their classes? And then the third page of it is identifying how they are going to reteach the areas of strength and of weakness. And so collaboratively, the English 10, there's 2 teachers. Did they have the same areas of weakness? How are they going to reteach it? How are we going to reassess it and identify what questions that we had on this particular test do we need to retest on the next test?
I'd just like to know, from a more academic standpoint, how is it, what type of process or processes exist to facilitate teachers as they go through the curriculum and develop the different formative assessments that are applicable to their respective content areas? Are there any type of processes?
There really are 3 approaches that are out there. You want an academic question? I'll give you an academic answer. There are 3 approaches that are out there. You can either buy fully developed units, and there's some really fascinating stuff. Groups like the Shell Center in England, Mars Group out in California, there are a whole bunch of either university-based or commercially based products that are out there that have the assessments and often come accompanied with instructional units that are part of that. The problem with those is they're of mixed quality, and you don't often get a lot of buy-in. That's one more externally mandated activity that's not always accepted at the teacher level. There's an intermediate step. A group such as Literacy by Design and others have what's called templates, where they give you a model where you basically fill in the blank for the instruction, for the lesson, for the content area. But it creates a template for the teachers to work with to put in, say, their own reading source, the type of questions they're asking. But it shapes the activity and has a scoring rubric associated with it. The advantage there is that the lessons are locally developed. The disadvantage is they tend to be uneven in quality. because some teachers are better at filling out the templates and they're facilitated less well. The third idea is what you may call chaos, but it can be structured chaos. And that is similar to what Alexandra's talking about. You convene your teachers and you use the value, all of the lessons that in their own experience to build formative type tasks that could then be tried out and used within and across classrooms at the school. The downside there is they may not be very good at this, and it takes a lot of administrative oversight to get these good enough. The advantage is they really buy into the process. They love, I'm going to tell a little secret, and you sort of alluded to it. You know what the real value of what they're doing there is? It's got very little to do with the assessment. They could be using regular classroom activities. You're creating an illusion of formality by buying the assessment. What they're really doing is talking to each other and looking at student work. And you're giving them a good structure to do that. The real advantage of that third chaos approach is that the teachers have bought into the activity because they built it themselves and are required now, both before and after, to develop and review the results. So you get strong buy-in and a lot of attention to the work. The downside is it may not be very good work they're attending to if they're not facilitated through that process.
One more question, yes.
This question is in regards to the Thurgood Marshall information. I was looking at your scores on page 4. That's for the DC CAS. That's your state assessment. Is that correct? Mm-hmm. Who gives the test for each subject? Are the teacher who's teaching them history, do they give the state assessment exam? The person who teaches math, are they giving the assessment to their students, et cetera?
Sure. So a few things about our state test in DC that people should know. One, there is no accountability on the student level. So students don't have to pass this test, and all the accountability is on the school. It's a 10th grade test. We don't have 9th grade tests in DC. It's reading, math, and science are our tests. Mm-hmm. When it comes to the actual state test, we group our kids by their advisory, and our advisors are administering the test. In terms of our internal benchmark assessments that we ourselves do, it's their English teacher who's doing it, it's their math teachers, so it's the teacher who's teaching that subject in which we're testing that is giving them that assessment.
I see. So it may be their own students, it may not be.
When it comes down to the state test, the actual state test that matters,
yes,
more than likely it's not their students.
It's not their students. Okay.
Because it's based on advisories, it's based on our resources in the school, how many kids we have per room, and some scheduling things. And so that it may be a teacher they don't know, it may be a staff member they don't know. The proctors have nothing in relation to the kids who are doing the test.
Okay, thank you.
Well, in our remaining time, what we'd like to do is give you some working time at your tables, and consider these guiding questions from the perspective of what you just heard, as well as what you're working on in your schools, in your districts, in your states. The first questions are, how do you currently balance assessments in your schools, districts, and states? What are your successes and challenges, and what resonated from the presentations today that you will consider moving forward? What skills and supports do your administrators, teachers, and students need to move to a more optimized place of formative and balanced assessments? How do you plan on getting there? And what are any critical next steps that you have in beginning to develop some action plans? I'd like to take about 10 minutes at your tables to explore these questions. Stanley and Alexandra will be floating around the room while you're doing this. You can certainly ask some other questions. We'd like to take just a few minutes at the end to report out, maybe sample from each of the 3 different levels, and see if we hopefully have an eye on coherence as we're building these action plans together. So take about 10 minutes at your table to explore these questions.
I think the balance thing is important. I totally can't. If you tie
I'll let people.
Never. Never.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
I'll float to you.
Okay.
We'll be at DC in June.
Okay.
I was wondering if I could visit the school.
When in June? You can, but we won't be in school session. So you wouldn't see classroom instruction. We'll be doing portfolio presentations.
Ooh, that's cool.
I'm sorry? Students. So all of our students, and this is not part of this, but all of our students have to do a portfolio presentation every year. And so they present on their academic work, their behavior, their citizenship. So there won't be classes, but you can definitely feel free to send me an email and we can identify.
Very interesting. I'm trying to get to that last
Yeah, I mean, I'll be honest, when I started, it was non-existent. It was chaos. And we use these assessments as a way to build and bridge collaboration, conversations around curriculum that people were not willing to have before. Because now it wasn't evaluative, but it was, you saw the data. So now, if you saw your colleague with better test scores than you, I didn't have to tell you to tell an expert. Your colleague, or you would see, like, hey, they're much higher than I am, so now I need to go talk to them. Right. How did you teach that? And this was the catalyst, because I had a faculty who were not initially going to do any of this. And so by doing this and saying, well, like, this is not evaluative, we took away all of that fear, and it was not, and when we do our data meetings, we don't sit there and go, well, you're period 3 versus 5, period 5. It's about the students, it's about the item analysis, but it got them talking. And from that talking, then they started planning. Now everybody plans together, and I did even simple things like all the algebra teachers have classrooms next door, so they're all talking to each other. My English 10 teams have the classroom. It's all that stuff that came out of that. Sure, and just shoot me an email. Very good. And where are you from, I'm sorry? Michigan. Okay, excellent. Hi. Okay. 9 through 12, 390 students, 100% African Americans.
Congratulations. Thank you. And they're trying to go from B to C. So all of the stuff that you're talking about is original from Florida. So with the Florida FCAT,
right,
it's all explained over, it was like bam, 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 over. I need to get your, do you have business card? Sure.
For us, a big piece was that honestly, it was looking at the responses.
Yeah, and that's it. That
got us over.
We went away from the multiple choice, but we call it Florida Big Sauce.
Right.
Big sauce.
Look at where can you make those gains. Like how can you move from mission to exceed? It's looking at where are your kids losing the most points. For us in DC, 15% of the test score was for responses. If I had 50% of kids not even answering them.
But I don't even think it's like, I don't even think it's like people never do that. That is where it is. Period. It's globally true. It doesn't let our math and environment where we're used to doing that. Yeah, not absolutely.
Okay. In our remaining minutes, and I know that wasn't as much time as we needed to explore those questions, but if we could possibly sample from, again, the high school, the district, and the state perspectives, and see if we've got an opportunity for alignment or coherence in building these systems together, and making sure that we're taking all those perspectives into consideration. I'd be interested from the high school perspective, excuse me, thank you. If from the high school perspective someone would like to talk about, actually let's start with the state perspective. If someone from the states would mind talking about how you're currently balancing assessments in your states from a formative, interim, and summative perspective, would one of the states mind volunteering? I hate to pick on the wise guy, but you look, no. Okay.
Thank you. The short answer is we don't. It's a big need.
Sure. And that's an honest perspective. Anybody else? Okay. From the district perspective, I would say, what skills and supports do you feel your administrators, your teachers, and your students need to get to this more optimized place? Would anybody from the district level be interested in volunteering?
Money and time.
Yes.
Till she comes. It's still a need, but it's something that we started this year with our year one SIG. We stagger our biweeklies, our pre and post term, pre, mid, and end of the year benchmarking and progress monitoring. We have the system that Thurgood Marshall has that we're using K-12 or grade 1 through 12. And the piece you don't have, our data coach has done for us, so I'll talk to you after.
One more?
So I'm going to stay away from the word coherence, but I'm going to use the word coordination,
okay,
prioritization, and integration. And so some of the work that we're doing in Chicago Public Schools is to really integrate all of our major initiatives. And something that we desperately need right now is a transition plan for the assessments, because as we're moving towards Park, how much investment are we going to make, and in what area are we really going to have a win for the district? So all the commentary from you, Alexandra, is really enlightening to us in that a lot of the effort that we want to take now is not only to do coordination, but to make the proper investment. So prioritize what we need to invest at this stage based on what we're going to get from state assessments and what we don't need to do at the district level. So I think sometimes we overshoot what we're trying to do at the district level and go too far. And in the meantime, we forget about prioritizing what we need to do around assessment. So,
interesting. Thank you. And lastly, from the school perspective, you can address any one of the three bullets or concepts. Would anyone like to volunteer? Either your skills needed, next steps, or how you're currently balancing assessment.
We find that we need that data person to enter the data. We collect a lot of data, but you're right about the time. And we have our professional learning communities, but we still need more time to spend looking at that data and determining strategies to improve instruction. And we do have the support of our state, who's working towards having data warehouses and things to put the information in and kick it back out.
Great, thank you. One more? Anybody? Well, we've run out of time, and we want to thank you all for coming, and we want to thank our panelists one more time, Stanley Rabinowitz and Alexandra Pardo. Let's give them one more round of applause.